My final question, and after that, we will be opening up the discussion to more detailed considerations also with our audience, is a quite broad but rather pertinent question here, and I think it could act also as a kind of closing question for this symposium. So it's basically to do with the idea of ethics of listening, and what would an ethics of listening entail for acoustic research? Now, to make this a little bit clearer, because I am using a term that is again quite loaded, it means something, for instance, rather different in Brandon's work than in the work of, say, psychoacoustics experts. If we consider acoustics as a critical and political framework, which we have been doing in a way in our last few statements here, how is this framework witnessed? What kinds of different regimes are at play when we research as listeners and listen as researchers? Can audibility be distributed or redistributed in the context of acoustic research? And here I am actually referring to works like Jacques Rancière's on more broadly the sensorial. What kinds of ethical presuppositions and implications does this kind of distribution or redistribution entail? So if we are going to speak about an ethics of listening in the context of acoustic research, and we define acoustics critically and politically, then what does that presuppose for our works as researcher listeners? How do we research as listeners? How do we listen as researchers? And what does this imply in terms of what we consider to be the spectrum of the audible? Who would like to go first?
To break the... Yeah. I will start by saying what's very central to my thinking, and not only to my thinking, to most of the people who deal with witnessing. I think that an ethics of witnessing or an ethics of listening, a key to that is the response that the responsibility we carry in responding to the other, and responding in ways that usually we respond to something that cannot be verified. In my situations, you are with eyewitnesses and nobody else can verify that. So I think it's important to respond. Our response is ethical in the sense that it does not assume this kind of position of a master-slave dialectic that we come to bestow validity or recognition to a testimony. But it somehow opens a debate, a discussion about exclusion and silencing, as you said, about inaudibility of certain voices. Now, listening as researchers, I think, I was thinking about what you wrote. It's never neutral. And, there's obviously our own positionality, class, gender, nationality, our own politics. I feel more strongly now working on Cyprus and my own politics, really. I feel my positionality very strongly now in this ethical moment of listening, and it's challenging me. But I think there's also the boundaries between researchers and research subjects are often blurred, also in subtle ways that we may not always understand. Obviously, me working on Cyprus is very present, but I think it's there also in previous work. So I think when we talk about the ethics of listening, it's important to ask the question, who is talking and who is listening? Who is allowed to talk and who is allowed to listen? And this, when we talk about the archive, I think this becomes very prominent, about how archives have been essentially built on excluding certain voices. But also with regard to our own privileges as listeners in kind of field work and our own biases. So for me, the ethics of listening is an intersubjective moment, like how you stand by these intersubjective moments, and I think what's important is to kind of repoliticize ethics, to call for this kind of repoliticization of ethics. And I think by that I mean that this idea of research neutrality of the researcher as an objective, as giving an objective opinion, I think is very problematic, especially when you do research, with migration, with violence. I think my position is that we need to take a position within our works, and that is the ethical position I find. So I think audibility research has a big role to play in the redistribution of the audible, as you call it, and kind of not only giving space to voices that have been suppressed or silenced, but also kind of showing the processes that allowed that to happen and rupturing them or undermining them. I think that's important. And I wanted to just, it kind of brought to my mind how, now when we think of the Second World War history, we think of oral history, we think of testimonies by survivors. But there was a time when the history of the Second World War was written by German historians, and that's what kind of brought the surge of these trauma studies and oral history. And I think it's very important to kind of reclaim that space for voices that come from below and inform, our work and the historical record.
From the very first moment that I read your questions, I have to say that these last two sentences, can audibility be redistributed or distributed in the context of acoustic research, and what kinds of ethical presuppositions and implications does this redistribution entail? I was thinking of our project Audibility, and I know that there was a presentation of part of this project one of these days by Yorgos and Anna Papaeti. And I would like to reflect a little bit on this project, which somehow developed an interest that I had to work on sound with deaf people, and what it meant for me in this, what this development meant in my general attitude and ways of approaching these issues through the years. I believe that sound and the sonic and listening and hearing and the voice especially, apart from being a kind of a reference to experience we have, it's a very interesting and rich metaphorical vocabulary. But it's very interesting that we use it, and we use it in different contexts as well. So although the ways of the deaf with sound are different than listening or hearing, I would insist in the use of these words and metaphors for many reasons, and for reasons that somehow redefine our ways of the rest. I mean, the hearing people with sound and with reality, if we consider their ways with sounds and their ways with hearing and listening. It's one of the reasons to talk about listening in the case of the deaf as well. So I would even talk about soundscapes and all the other terms that we use in the sonic environment and in the people in the group of people who work with sound, and use them in the case of the deaf as well. But in their case, somehow this reflected also a kind of a way of, could be criticized as a re-essentializing of the sonic, because somehow we insisted, we imposed somehow an interest in approaching and trying to find out a way of sound, a way of relating with sound through vision, vibration, and touch, and how we can go a little bit beyond hearing. So somehow this is a question of the hearing imposed on the deaf. And of course, our informants and the people we work with were somehow kind enough to us and our questions, and the question that we asked ourselves perhaps sometimes. So I'm getting straight to the ethics of research here. And after the end of this project, I have to say to you, I'm sure that perhaps you discussed a bit about it with Yorgos and Dana these days. After the end of this research, I came to some kind of a general reflection on my side on what it means, for me at least, or the other researchers involved in it, in order, when we try to expand or extend our ways with sound in general and include people who do not hear in this case, and if that could be kind of an imposition on our side. So by the end of that project, I came to try to find out researchers or even artists, deaf sound artists, who are not so much into that direction, who are somehow perhaps also critical of all these perspectives, and they are perhaps more playful towards the way we in the hearing try to find out alternative phenomenologies and different ways of the deaf with sound. And although I believe that that was a kind of a very interesting way of approaching sound and quite revelatory in terms of our general attitudes and relations with the sonic world. On the other hand, I think that perhaps, at least for me, it will be time to get a step back and try to think about what this, I wouldn't say imposition on my side at this point, but somehow this way of trying to approach things could have other aspects as well in terms of ethics and epistemology, and things that I would like to think about one more time, and somehow they make me rethink my research as a researcher of sound and phenomenologies of sound again, but now from a different kind of direction than the one that I was interested in the beginning of such a project. I would leave it here for a moment, and perhaps we can return to that if you are interested. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, ethics, yes, challenging, essential, and maybe again just going back to thinking about my own experience and practice and areas of interest. Particularly, for instance, over the more recent years, being very focused on creating situations like this, or fostering gatherings and collaborative environments. So in a way, thinking about organizing this, and the organization of space and the organization of certain kinds of conditions, particularly for listening to happen. So I think for myself, quite briefly, really, I would think that an ethics of listening is really about the creation or the fostering of holding environments. It's a kind of holding environment. An environment that also is there to allow things to be said, which I think Anna is also involved with, as well as the unsaid, right? As we've talked about silence or the unspoken, all the things that also surround language and the discursive, sort of giving room for that, giving room for a range of abilities, as well as maybe truths. So this holding environment, I think for me, is a sort of ethical position. Again, in my own practice, creating or fostering a holding environment. And I think at the beginning we also, sort of when we started the symposium, we talked a little bit about time. Yeah. So I think holding that environment also is a spatial question, but a temporal question. It's really giving time, I think, is really increasingly fundamental, particularly if we think about the pressures that we face all around us. Having time is a challenge. So if we're able to kind of hold those environments, I think this is a really fundamental ethical position. And I think for myself, going to the question of acoustics, again, acoustic research, I've also been really interested to focus on acoustics, particularly around this question of the distribution of the herd and the kind of regimes of audibility that shape that distribution. And here, I think I'd also be interested to think acoustics as something that is maybe not only fundamentally connected to sound, as like a sort of something that we hear, what is the thing that we hear, but thinking about acoustics as that which creates the conditions for that hearing to take place, right? So I think in my own practice, that holding environment is fundamentally an acoustic question in terms of how do we create the conditions for the said and the unsaid, right? So that itself as a practice. So I've been interested to really move from an idea of sonic practice to an acoustic practice. Yes. And here we can also think that this also becomes a question of audibility, but also about orientation. Yes. Think about acoustics as fundamentally about orientation. And I think that came up somewhere in a presentation about vertigo or about balance, I think was brought up. So the way that the ear is also connected to those issues and experiences. So again, how do we then practice acoustics? How do we create those conditions for audibility, but also for how we orient ourselves around particular issues, discourses, or around particular communities? Finding orientation, I think, is also an ethical question. And here I've been maybe just wanting to pose a little bit, following some of Danae's further questions about acoustic research, to then think, well, in certain situations, what are those practices? What are those acoustic practices that we might find a certain kind of possibility? Again, thinking about how orientation can be worked and reworked, yes. How regimes of audibility can be addressed and redressed. So here, maybe I think about particular situations. Again, maybe going back to even this last few days as a particular acoustics, to think about questions such as rhythm, such as volume, such as vibration, such as affection, these aspects that I think are maybe metaphorically connected to sound as a topic, but then in and of themselves can also be appreciated as practices or as aspects that contribute to questions of orientation, etc. So, and I think these are also can be quite subtle and nuanced kinds of practices that aren't necessarily, again, about content, but about facilitating certain conditions. So I often think, for instance, about vibration really as, and I have probably addressed this maybe in some conversations we've had individually, but about ecologies of feeling. Yes. So we think about vibration as an ecology of feeling. We can think, well, how does that contribute to an acoustic position, an acoustic construct, this holding environment? How does vibration as an ecology of feeling participate in shaping that holding environment? Again, if we think about acoustic practices as that which contributes to fostering a holding environment, right? So again, how do we create those conditions? For me, vibration and this idea of an ecology of feeling becomes one avenue, one sort of framework. And maybe this leads us back to hospitality. As we think about how do we nurture an ecology of feeling? How do we become sensitive to spaces as questions of feeling. So again, to create or to be sensitive to an acoustic situation is to also consider this vibrational, maybe we can think about it as a kind of ambience of tonality, how that contributes to a sort of possibility of speaking or not, or the possibility of hearing each other or not. How do we feel in such a space? Do we feel actually able to speak? Does this ecology of feeling welcome me or not? All those aspects that I think contribute to what is said and what is unsaid, and even the unsaid as carrying a certain content. How do we sense that content if it's not spoken? So I think vibration is really, for me, one aspect, one facet to acoustic research, and again, to a kind of ethical approach to addressing audibility and orientation. And so that I just offer that as one kind of reference. There's others we could explore, particularly around rhythms, for instance. But here, I think in my own practice, I've then been led to an idea of acoustic care. So thinking, of course, there's a lot of discussions around care, which are very, I think, very important and very helpful these days. And for me, I've been wanting to bring that also into our discussions about sound and acoustic research, to think about what is acoustic care, what can that be? Again, if we really understand acoustics as that which impacts onto the distribution of the herd, and that really shapes our orientations, then caring for that is really fundamental. And maybe here we could also appreciate how an acoustic care, a position of acoustic care, can also be a question of a certain kind of political perspective. If we think about something like the right to listen. Of course, there's a lot of discussions about the right to speak and the freedom of speech. It might be within the sort of configurations of an acoustic care position that we might be able to argue for the right to listen as a fundamental right. So to really sort of put that on the table and to understand the freedom of listening as really something that we need to argue for. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We will gradually open this discussion to the audience, and thank you for your different approaches to listening, as we've been doing this also in this rather scripted way. To go a little bit off script, I find it very interesting that we've obviously been developing different sides to listening practices, as well as to what we consider to be the acoustic and what we consider to be the ethics associated to that. I found there's always an opportunity to somehow frame and reframe provisionally or more, let's say, in more fixed ways, this question of distribution. For instance, this idea of holding the space, which is a very, very resonant metaphor, and I'm using a sonic metaphor here again, also makes me think about questions of, time management, of how, for instance, in research, we sometimes tend to forget to ask questions like, who is holding the administrative and organizational space in order for research to unfold, and how? How is funding distribution related to questions of how our metaphors are being shaped? So there's also these questions that I'm just kind of throwing right now in the room, so that we can also keep them under consideration. That's the reason why I ask these disciplinary questions to begin with about, challenges that one may be facing in terms of their own research. Whether we deal with a sonic from a perspective of a funded research project or not, whether we deal with it from a perspective that allows for cross-disciplinary experimentation between the arts and sciences or not, and for a playful take on these binaries, or whether this needs to be a more hardline approach, sometimes it's not just a question of personal agency. And especially, this is very true when we are dealing with modes of knowledge production and dissemination that haven't been registered as common practice yet in particular countries, different areas and different institutions. So I'm opening this discussion at the moment to more general or specific questions or comments that may have come to people's minds. And I'm wondering if anyone would like to set, something that has been on their mind all this while while listening to us patiently or in a challenged situation.